Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining us for the first summer seminar. The Madison Public Library is so pleased to have this summer seminar series, which has always been a very popular summer library event, now in its 36th year, and it's organized by a committee of volunteers and library staff. And who would have ever thought we'd be doing it virtually this year? But we are flexible and we adapt. This series began in 1985, and it offers a range of topics of general interest: politics, foreign affairs, current events, history, literature, sports, art, music, science, culture, travel, and hobbies. And so we're very fortunate to have Doug Simon with us here today. And Doug, I'm going to give it to you to take away. For those of you who are not as familiar with Zoom, you can click on speaker view so that you have Doug front and center, large on your computer. Okay, and I'm going to mute everybody. I think if you're not already muted, I will mute you. Enjoy the program.
Thank you very much. I wish we were doing this face-to-face, but circumstances don't allow it. I have to tell you, my talk today is a little bit on the grim side, could be a little depressing. But there is a silver lining to the presentation today, and that is that I'm not talking about COVID-19, and I'm not talking about Black Lives Matter, and I'm not talking about reopening the economy, nor am I talking about the dilemmas in opening the public school systems. Now, all of those problems are obviously important, really critical. But I think they've had the cumulative effect over the last, I don't know, few weeks, certainly, last couple of months, of shoving the whole issue of climate change into the background. We don't hear too much about it. So this is my contribution today. Let me be absolutely upfront about this presentation. I consider climate change as the most critical challenge of our age. And I say this because, first, while not unanimous, the overwhelming, truly overwhelming body of scientific evidence that it is a real phenomenon. Second, that the destructive consequences of inaction are nothing short of catastrophic. And third, this is not merely an American problem. It is, as I think most of you know, a global problem. Now, contemporary concern for environment as an issue of national security, which is really the topic today, actually goes back almost 50 years to, 50 years to 1970. It was then that perhaps the most eminent foreign policy luminary of his time, George Kennan, suggested the need for an independent international institution to track and to coordinate information on what nation states did to impact the environment. In 1974, General Maxwell Taylor, who earlier led our troops in the Korean War after MacArthur's firing, criticized the National Security Council for ignoring the environment as an issue of national security. But to be honest, climate change was not foremost in the thinking of these and other foreign policy gurus at the time. Concern really was on the possible conflict over natural resources, particularly water and oil. The whole notion of conflict related to global warming and to climate change was relatively obscure. However, as the Cold War waned and at the same time as man's carbon footprint dramatically increased, concerns about climate change and its relationship to national security, including violent conflict, increased dramatically. Some of the earliest concern in the early and mid-1980s came from scientists and prominent politicians in places like Canada and Norway. They were growing increasingly alarmed by the scientific data that was emerging that indicated that something very serious was going on in terms of the Earth's temperature and its weather patterns. In 1988, near record temperature and drought sparked interest in the United States, and James Hansen, the director of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, testified before the United States Senate. In his testimony, he asserted that there was a 99% certainty that the climate was indeed changing as a result of human contributions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. As time went on, the basic cause and effect phenomena became clear. As a result of human behavior, the frozen water on the Earth, or what is known as the cryosphere, was melting. This was leading to sea level rises, and melting sea ice was exposing darker ocean waters, which absorbed more sunlight than ice, thereby heating the ocean more and speeding the heating process. Second, as the atmosphere got hotter, the oceans that absorbed 90% of the extra heat in the climate were getting hotter, causing the oceans to expand and contributing to sea level rises. Third, because of the higher temperatures, there was increased evaporation of water, and that is like fuel for storms, exacerbating extreme weather events such as hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones. More storm surges, more severe prolonged droughts, and wildfires. Of course, Hansen's testimony also triggered vociferous reaction from global warming skeptics of all types, a broad spectrum of the business community, particularly oil and coal executives. Government officials, particularly members of Congress, along with some leading economists, were terrified of the implications of what Hansen was saying. They were no doubt frightened by the potential monetary cost of confronting such a threat, the impact on business, federal and state budgets, perhaps the very structure of the economy. In general, they publicly based their skepticism on what they felt was not enough data, a situation that is now rapidly dissipating. In recent years, the preponderance of global scientific community has churned out study after study after study, confirming two things. First, that we are already in the early stages of climate change, and second, the major contributor is mankind itself, that has been increasing the carbon footprint since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the mid-19th century. Indeed, the more recent rate at which we are doing this is pretty frightening. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, roughly 85% of the burning of fossil fuels has taken place since the end of World War II, and 50% just since the year 1989. Within the United States, as more and more data was generated, reactions did not fall into two simple groups of believers and skeptics. There were those who fully accepted the scientific data and buttressed by what they saw with their own eyes, more frequent and severe storms, more flooding, more wildfires, and of course the melting of the polar ice caps. Further, this group believes that we must engage in bold, meaningful international programs of action. There were those who accepted that climate change was real, but that the projections on its severity of its impact were exaggerated and alarmist. Others accepted that global warming was real, but there was little we could do to reverse it, because we were not the primary cause. Our only course was to adapt using, of course, our technology. There were, to be sure, those who believed that the whole thing was a hoax, and finally, there were those who just did not want to think about it at all. Now, while these groupings are still reflected within the American public, in recent years it has become increasingly difficult to ignore the multiple consequences of climate change: ice cap melting, more severe storms, flooding, prolonged droughts, etc. And the latest data from multiple polling sources clearly indicates that the American people are increasingly worried about this problem. The problem comes from the fact that far too many Americans are willing to do much about it. The cost, as they see it, is just too high. Now, there are two things that make our understanding of the relationship between climate change and national security difficult. The first is that for most humans, climate change itself appears to be unfolding slowly over decades, making it difficult to foster a real sense of urgency. For the average human being, changes in climate are unfolding slowly. And the thinking is, well, if these environmentalists are right, how come our cities are not underwater? The second problem directly related to national security is making the case for a direct link between climate change and human conflict. Violent human conflict is rarely caused by a single factor. It is multi-causal: tribalism, economic deprivations, issues of sovereignty, revenge, miscommunication. The list is almost endless. It is certainly possible that direct causal relationships may occur, but a more valuable concept is one developed by the US military, that climate change can act as a threat multiplier. A fancy way of saying that climate change can exacerbate an already bad situation. The most famous case of this is the devastating Syrian civil war. The war that began in March of 2011 was the result of complex interrelated factors. The focus of the conflict was, of course, regime change, the overthrow of the Assad government. But the triggers, including a broad set of religious and socio-political factors, the erosion of the economic health of the country, a wave of political reform sweeping over the Middle East and North Africa as a result of the Arab Spring, and the policies of a brutal authoritarian government. Now, from 1900 to 2005, a period of 105 years, there were six significant droughts in Syria, where the average monthly level of winter precipitation, the major rainfall season, dropped to about 1/3 of normal. 5 of these droughts lasted only 1 season. The 6th lasted 2. Starting in 2006, however, and lasting until 2011, a mere 5-year period, Syria experienced a multi-season, multi-year period of extreme drought that contributed to agricultural failures, economic dislocations, and ultimately population displacement. Between 2006 and 2009, around 1.3 billion inhabitants of eastern Syria were affected by agricultural failures. 1.3 million were affected by agricultural failures. An estimated 800,000 people lost their livelihoods and basic food supports. This in turn triggered a migration of thousands of rural Syrians to urban centers like Damascus, exacerbating an already strained, conflict-prone society. Rather than a direct causal factor of the Syrian civil war, adverse climate in the form of severe multi-year drought acted as a threat multiplier, making a bad situation worse. The multiplier effect will probably be felt by the most vulnerable regions of the world, specifically within the equatorial belt, where we will experience more insurgency movements, massive migrations, etc., both posing serious security problems. Now, the Center for Climate Security is a Washington-based think tank whose name reflects their primary concern. A think tank that studies the impact of climate change on both national and global security. Its advisory board has 21 former admirals and generals and 9 members of the scientific community. The center has identified 12 what they label as epicenters, where climate change could stress global security, possibly igniting conflicts around the world, or at least exacerbating them. There is some overlap to these epicenters, so I have taken the liberty of consolidating several of them to save a bit of time. First, there is the threat to water towers and the weaponization of water. Most of the analysis on the threat to safe drinking and irrigation water focuses on water flashpoints, particularly in the Middle East, and on access to rivers, aquifers, and watersheds at the national level. And to be sure, these are significant. But the discussion often ignores what we might call the mega-scale threat to water, namely mountain water towers. For example, 2 billion people depend on water originating on the Tibetan Plateau, and hundreds of millions more drink from global water towers, including the massive Andes, the Rockies, Tian Shan, the Caucasus and the Alps, and the more modest Ethiopian and Guinean highlands. Now, one problem with dwindling water from these water towers is that when water flows through several states, downriver states remain vulnerable to upstream users who may seek to dam it up or divert it. And this is more likely to happen as the water from the water towers begins to dwindle. For instance, China desperately needs water. While it has roughly 22% of the world's population, it has only 7% of its fresh water. And demand is increasing as China's economy continues to grow. In 2013, the Chinese mentioned diverting the Yarlong-Tsangpo Brahmaputra River from the Tibetan border region. This is the longest river in Tibet and feeds into various other rivers in both India and Nepal. The Chinese even mentioned that nuclear explosions could be used to blast a passageway through the Himalayas. Well, India went apoplectic. India's unsurprising response was that any diversion of the river would be considered an act of aggression, and the potential for the two most populous and nuclear-equipped nations going to war dwarfs anything that the Middle East could present. Most recently, we have the case of Ethiopia that is constructing a major dam on the Nile River some 2,000 miles upriver from Cairo. To put it mildly, Egypt is angry and very worried. She has a rapidly growing population with enormous food needs, and any interruption of the Nile would seriously affect the irrigation systems that are vital to Egypt's economy. So where does climate change fit into all of this? Well, think of massive glaciers as giant stable reservoirs with annual modest melting, feeding major rivers, supplying both drinking and irrigation water. But what is happening and getting worse as a result of increasing global temperatures? Obviously, the rapid melting, even disappearance of large glaciers. This alters the rate of flow of water, the supply of water, downriver flooding, food production, a whole host of problems involving multiple countries. Access to safe water is already a problem under normal circumstances. Climate change threatens to make it much worse, a threat multiplier, if you will. In the current issue of National Geographic, there's a terrific article on this very subject, focusing on the impact of climate change on some of the great glaciers of the Himalayas that feed into the Indus River, that in turn provides water to some 270 million people in India, Pakistan, and China. The World Resource Institute, in their 2019 data report, identifies 17 countries home to 1/4 of the world's population that are at high water stress levels, basically threatened with running out of water. Those countries are Qatar, Iran, Lebanon, Jordan, Libya, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Eritrea, the United Arab Emirates, San Marino, Bahrain, India, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Oman, and Botswana. Several urban areas are also at high risk: Cape Town, South Africa, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Chennai in China, Chennai in India, and Mexico City. In addition to the problem of disappearing water towers, there is the issue of the weaponization of water. Climate change water stress across the Middle East and Africa is providing an opportunity for various extremist organizations waging internal conflicts to wield water as a weapon. In other words, if you do not do as we say, we will disrupt or contaminate your water. An example of this was on August 7th, 2014, ISIS seized control of the 3.2 kilometer long Mosul Dam on the Tigris River, upstream from Mosul and Baghdad in northern Iraq, and threatened to destroy the dam, and that could kill thousands and inundate Baghdad with a wall of water. Thankfully, the dam was re-seized from ISIS by Iraqi and Kurdish forces with the assistance of US air support. Similarly, in Somalia, the terrorist group al-Shabaab has held cities for ransom by cutting off the supply of water. Now, the second epicenter of climate insecurity was the disappearance of states and water inundation in coastal regions. There is no doubt that sea levels have risen over the past half century by an average of 2.8 millimeters a year. And the first threat of this phenomena is to the very existence of low-lying islands, like those in the Marshall Island chain in the Pacific or the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. Some of these islands are already suffering from dangerous extreme weather and the loss of food and fresh water resources. But eventually, some of them will cease to exist at all. It will not happen immediately, as Plato said of Atlantis, but eventually we will be faced with both controlled and uncontrolled migration from these islands and finding new land for displaced citizens to live in a new country. But of course, that is only part of the problem. Great powers have major strategic interest in many of these vulnerable locales. For instance, the island Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean is a critical logistics hub for the US and United Kingdom militaries operating in the Middle East. On Kwajalein, in the Marshall Islands, the United States has invested billions of dollars into significant radar and ballistic missile defense systems. And both of these islands are used as ground stations assisting the operations of the Global Positioning Navigation System. Another island threatened with climate change is Guam. Guam is the home for major US naval and air bases. It has the largest fuel and weapons capacity of any US installation in Asia, along with 12,000 service members and their families. In addition to both humanitarian and strategic threat to these vulnerable islands, there is a threat of rising sea levels along coastal regions. Already, coastal Louisiana and northern Alaska are reckoning with moving entire towns because of sea level rise. Cities such as Miami and New Orleans face a threat. The low-lying Pearl River Delta region of China, around which China's economic powerhouses of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou are beginning to feel the effects and could see vast swaths of its land submerged. A recent study published by the Journal of Nature estimates that upward of 400 million people could be displaced by storm surges and rising sea levels. The third epicenter of climate and security is called dire straits. The impact of climate change on the great international waterways of the world, the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Straits of Malacca between Malaysia and Indonesia, the Strait of Hormuz leading in and out of the Persian Gulf, and Bab el-Mandeb Strait between Yemen and Djibouti. For these waterways and maritime choke points, more severe weather patterns will impact shipping. Coastal ports that service some of these waterways will suffer from rising sea levels and have to be moved. Canals in particular will be impacted by rising sea levels. A fourth epicenter of climate insecurity involves infectious disease. Zika, Ebola, avian flu, SARS before them, and now COVID-19. As these epidemics unfolded, security and military agencies have increasingly been forced to come to grips with the impact of health and disease on national security. A key turning point of this was when the HIV AIDS epidemic was deemed a national security threat by the US National Intelligence Council. Climate change enters the picture in a number of ways. Dramatic changes in weather may alter disease trends. First, the speed, frequency, and geospatial range of these diseases can be dramatically altered by shifting weather patterns. Second, changing patterns of natural disasters and extreme weather events may lead to increased transmission of disease. Third, as climate acts as a threat multiplier to violent conflict, refugee migratory dynamics increase health risks to not only relief workers, but the populations of countries that take in large numbers of refugees. And finally, new or latent pathogens may be released from the thawing permafrost and tundra. These may be agents of well-known maladies like smallpox, anthrax, botulism, a variety of viruses and bacteria, hundreds or even thousands of years old, that we are unfamiliar with and prove resistant to known drugs. Now, I should not have to elaborate too much on the fifth epicenter between climate and security, namely serious disruption in the production of food. Here we are talking about violent weather patterns, cyclones, tornadoes, prolonged drought, wildfires, and flooding impacting land-based crops. Of particular concern is the availability of water suitable for irrigation, the global stress on water supplies that we spoke of earlier. Also, agricultural land in coastal regions will suffer increased salination as sea levels increase and salt water moves inland. And of course, we are also talking about the impact of climate change on the world's seafood resources. Not only is climate change raising the ocean's sea surface temperatures, but is also causing the world's oceans to become more acidic, driving changes in salinity levels, altering oxygen and carbon concentrations, and affecting the variability of the planet's major ocean surface currents. This will be particularly bad for those residing in the equatorial zones where the greatest damage from climate change will take place. In these regions, there is enormous dependency on marine life for food, up to 20% of the daily diet for over 1.4 billion people. 3 global fish security epicenters have been identified, where climate change has the potential to significantly impact regional and global security. The South China Sea, the Arctic, and the African Great Lakes. A 6th epicenter of climate change and security is in the form of human displacement and migration. We are now at a point when the world is experiencing the largest number of displaced people since the end of World War II. And for a variety of reasons, things are likely to get worse, driven by climate change. We have already noted the likely migration of people from inland communities, vulnerable to being eliminated by rising sea levels. Similarly, we will experience a good deal of displacement of people from low-lying coastal areas as people in sizable numbers move inland, or at least to higher ground. We also noted earlier in the Syrian case, the mass migration of rural citizens to urban areas in desperate search of work as their agricultural-based lives collapsed around them due to long-term drought. Waves of immigrants and those seeking asylum placing stress on social, economic, and political systems is nothing new in the human experience. But depending on how serious the effects of climate change are, the numbers could be staggering and unprecedented. 2 additional epicenters of climate change and security are offered by the Center on Climate and Security: the Arctic and global nuclear security. I'm not going to say too much about the threat of nuclear security. Concerns about stockpiles of nuclear weapons and fissionable material should be self-evident. Violent weather patterns, drought, flooding, and the like lead to greater social and political instability. And in regions like Pakistan, India, and the Middle East, where climate change will be particularly harsh, there is always the risk of the security systems guarding nuclear weapons and materials breaking down. As for the Arctic, no other place on Earth is changing faster. The problem is the high degree of uncertainty about the security consequences of these changes. For as long as we have known, enormous areas of the Arctic have been characterized by massive sheets of thick ice. That is rapidly changing and is already contributing to the rise in sea level and coastal erosion in northern Canada and Alaska. And while this phenomena does open the possibility for new shipping routes and natural resource exploitation, it also raises a host of questions. Whose sea lanes are these? What are the dangers of militarization of the Arctic? Can we control it? But a lot of this remains just that, questions. Both the awareness of what is happening and subsequent policies can be traced back to 2007. The Russians had been holding military exercise in the Arctic for years, so nothing was new there. But in August, they planted a Russian flag at the bottom of the ocean at the North Pole. That was new and was followed by an accelerated Russian military presence in the region. Now, countries surrounding the Arctic each have a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, in which to operate. In other words, the zones extend from the coastline 200 miles and at some point begin to penetrate the Arctic. The countries include Russia, the United States, Canada, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. The Russian zone is enormous. The US Arctic zone is relatively small and comes from the northern coast of Alaska. But it is important to note that we have historically worked very closely with Canada, whose zone is much larger, to secure both countries' security interests. The critical problems come not so much from the assigned territory. That issue is by and large settled by virtue of the exclusive economic zones. The critical problems are claims in areas where the continental shelf extends beyond the 200 miles of the exclusive zones. Second, how the trillions of dollars in resources is to be handled in these areas. Gold, diamonds, rare earth metals, petroleum, natural gas, fish. And third, there is the issue of access and security to the new shipping lanes. The Russians have engaged in significant military buildup in recent years, and Norway, Canada, Denmark, and the United States are strengthening their own military presence in the region. How this story ends is anybody's guess, but it is potentially a dangerous security problem directly linked to climate change. Well, facing this array of security threats brought on by climate change, what has the US military done? I think three things can be said here. First, the level of awareness about climate change and the threat that it poses for the American military establishment is very high. Within the upper military command structure, there is near universal acceptance that climate change is real and poses a serious security threat. Second, with few exceptions, most of the military responses to climate change are in the planning stages. While it has been prescient in recognizing the threats posed by climate change, it has not been as productive in laying out a coherent strategy for dealing with it and what it will cost. There are, to be sure, exceptions. Virtually all new construction on coastal military facilities is taking into account rising sea levels, and there is increased avoidance of putting critical equipment, supplies, and people at or below sea level. A recent Pentagon report focused on 79 American installations across all the armed forces currently suffering from climate stress. 53 installations like Norfolk Naval Base face persistent vulnerability to sea level rise and flooding. Norfolk has the largest concentration of US naval forces in the world. Tyndall Air Force Base near Panama City in Florida was pummeled in 2018 by Hurricane Michael, the strongest storm to ever hit the Panhandle. Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska, headquarters for Strategic Command, has suffered incredible flood damage. 80 buildings were recently affected, and the central runway was flooded almost 30 feet in some places. And a $1 billion radar installation built on the Marshall Islands is projected to be underwater within 2 decades. 43 installations face heavy drought conditions. 36 are exposed to serious wildfires. 6 installations are already falling victim to what is known as desertification. That is, the expansion of desert terrain due to prolonged drought. Some cases are extreme. For instance, the Sahara Desert in North Africa is expanding at a rate of roughly 100 miles per year. One base in Alaska is dealing with the thawing permafrost, resulting in unstable ground foundations as well as potential health hazards. Now, some change is already being forced on the military, particularly in response to climate-driven disaster around the world. Military personnel are increasingly being used to help fight wildfires out west, respond to massive flooding in the Midwest, provide rescue and recovery efforts in Tornado Alley, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, etc., and providing food, water, medical care, restoration of infrastructure from typhoons and other disasters in South and Southeast Asia, as well as disasters in this country. These types of missions have been increasing at an alarming rate in recent years, and the military has been examining their allocation of resources and personnel to respond to them. Third, a great deal of what has to be done in the military responding to climate change is going to require significant funding, and it is not entirely clear whether that funding will be available. Why? Well, largely because 2 elements in the government, the White House and the Pentagon, are such different minds on the whole climate change issue. On the one hand, the Trump administration has pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, proposed eliminating 3 vital new climate satellites, reneged on the Obama-era commitment to climate fund, is slashing funding the Environmental Protection Agency's climate programs, and the State Department's USAID climate programs around the world. The president has also denounced global warming as a hoax and at one time claimed it was a Chinese plot. On the other hand, the Pentagon, as I've already noted, clearly feels that climate change is a national security threat, and the House, in a rare bipartisan mode, has sided with the Pentagon. The Senate is less sure of its position. So will there be significant funding for the U.S. military to deal with climate change threat? That remains to be seen. My whole point here is that there is concern within the United States military establishment about climate change and its national security implications. Now, as I read about all this great concern by the Pentagon, excuse me, to the threat of global warming and climate change, something began to bother me. And it was then that I read David Wallace Wells' The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. I don't know if you can see this. I'll repeat the title and stuff. David Wallace Wells is the author. The book, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. Wallace Wells is a national fellow at the New America Foundation and deputy editor of the New York Magazine. The book is without a doubt one of the most frightening I have ever read. And in my line of work, have read a lot of books about the horrors of interstate conventional warfare, the incredible destructiveness of nuclear war, civil war, genocide, and other horrible things we have done and continue to do to each other. But Wallace Wells' book is in a class by itself. He paints an unsparing image of the consequences of man-induced global warming over the next roughly 100 years. And it is frightening. The list of extreme, but all that is extreme, but all too familiar. Large swaths of the planet equatorial zone totally uninhabitable for humans due to killer heat. Massive food shortages. Coastal geography altered due to the rise in sea level. Wildfires consuming millions of square miles of land. Unimaginable shortages of fresh water. A world of dying oceans. Horrific pandemics. Entire economies collapsing. And unimaginable air pollution. Much of this occurring simultaneously. Now, admittedly, this vision of an Earth seemingly headed for an apocalyptic future is a worst-case scenario that would unfold over decades, perhaps a century, if we did virtually nothing. But it is terrifying nonetheless. After having read the book, I asked myself the question, what am I doing? Why am I so concerned about what the US military is doing to address some of the national security concerns resulting from global warming? Some adjustments to the flooding of coastal military installations, a shift in mission with greater emphasis on disaster relief, management of an increase in refugee flow, put up some windmills on US military bases. It all seemed pretty patchwork to me, given those apocalyptic projections that Wallace Wells put forward. But then I thought, that is not really fair. The job of the US military is not to solve the climate change problem. The fact is that a well thought out, adequately funded national security plan for adapting to climate change should be undertaken by the military. Failure to do so would be irresponsible on their part. Sure, the military can take steps to try and reduce their carbon footprint, which happens to be the largest of any single entity in the world. But ultimately, it is not their responsibility to solve the climate change problem. Indeed, in many ways, they are doing more to address climate change than almost any other federal government institution. I have no idea whether or not climate change can be halted or even reversed. But I do think that it is totally irresponsible to future generations if we do not try. No doubt it would take a Herculean international, multidimensional effort involving first and foremost a massive shift to renewable energy sources like wind, tidal, solar, yes, perhaps nuclear. Stopping massive deforestation in its tracks, the kind of deforestation we see in Indonesia, Africa, and most recently in the Amazon basin in Brazil. Carbon sequestration through things such as farming of massive amounts of sea kelp, the reforestation of trees like redwoods, both capable of absorbing large amounts of carbon dioxide, and perhaps even the use of CO2 capturing machines. Well, this all constitutes a pretty grim picture, and among professionals who study climate change, as well as ordinary informed citizens, optimism is in short supply. Is there any reason to believe this potentially apocalyptic future can be avoided? Surprisingly, my answer is yes, but a big qualified yes. While the worst case scenario is grim, it is nevertheless, by and large, man-made. We are not talking about a work of pure nature, a terrifying solar flare, a large meteor colliding with the Earth, or a sudden horrific earthquake disaster, all disasters over which we would have absolutely no control. No, climate change as we know it today originates with us, with human activity, which has the potential to be altered. Living habits can be changed. Alternative fuels can be adopted. Deforestation can be halted. Now, the window for effective action may be very narrow, and we may be approaching a point where it might be impossible to totally escape the impact of climate change, but it may be possible to slow it down or at least significantly lessen its impact. In my judgment, this is the greatest security challenge facing mankind. Can we meet that challenge? I don't really know, but it is imperative that we try. Thank you very much. love to open it up for any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Incredible presentation. I am blown away by the amount of knowledge that you have. So I'm sure that there are questions. I think perhaps if someone has a question, just type in chat and then we can unmute you and you can ask your question.
Sure. Well, you know, for her to come here though, she would need work papers. She would need.
If that was a question, could you repeat it again?
I don't think it was a question. I think it was just background. Okay, so Hal, let's see if I can find you. Hal has a question.
Or you put in the chat.
Okay, Hal, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
There we go.
There you go.
There you go.
Okay. I heard a presentation about a week ago. Some scientists were going to look at plankton in the oceans, saying that plankton is one of the major absorbers of CO2, and part of the climate problem is the volume of plankton is being decreased. Have you heard about that?
Yeah, well, I have heard about the decrease. I hadn't actually heard about plankton being a huge absorber of CO2. I knew that kelp was, but that's interesting. Yeah, and it's very sad. I mean, what's happening in the oceans is really, really catastrophic with so many implications. I mean, it's just not, you know, fish dying and so forth. It's weather patterns because of the changing. Actually more evaporation of the water because of the increase in temperature. Marine life in terms of food supply is being affected. It's really bad.
I guess your points were so strong, everybody's crushed here. Nobody wanted to raise the question.
Yeah, I told you it was a bit grim.
Put it in chat.
Should we read that book?
I didn't know. I was going to ask you, well, make a comment, kind of. My husband had a professional journal, or not a journal, I guess it's like a news magazine or something. Mm-hmm. And they had somebody who was discussing and saying how climate change is the next, well, we knew about pandemic, and we didn't prepare for it. We know about climate change. Now we can prepare for it because we know that by not being prepared for a pandemic, that wasn't a good thing. And we were prepared, but we weren't prepared. You know what I mean? It was done in the government level somewhere, in the military level, but then it wasn't coordinated. This was before it even became that we were going to have COVID. You know, right. Because we had other ones. So what he was saying was that this speaker or writer, he was from Australia, and he was saying that what we need to do is we're going to have to do a concerted effort. It's not going to be just the United States or just Australia, whatever. It's going to have to be a lot of cooperation, which is what we should have in a pandemic. The same thing we're going to need in climate change.
Oh, I think that observer is absolutely correct.
That was from Australia, so.
Yeah, well, in Australia felt the brunt of those terrible wildfires down there because of prolonged drought conditions this past year. No, I couldn't agree more. And see, one of the dilemmas, it seems to me, in the climate change business, and I think to a certain extent the military is reflective of this. There is a difference between adapting to climate change. Oh, move some of the bases inland and so forth. There's a difference between that and attacking the causes of climate change. And I think to some extent you have to do both, because we're already into climate change and there's going to be some things that we can't reverse. We're going to be affected by it. But I don't think that we should make the primary commitment to the adaptation model. The primary commitment's got to go to the source, which are the gases being emitted largely because of human activity. And that right now is a tough sell. And I also, I think the point that you made and the author made that this is a global problem and has to be met on a global basis, cooperative basis, I think is absolutely on target. And I don't mean for this presentation to get, too political, but I think this is one of the things that is so distressing about what Washington's been doing in the last, 3.5 years, alienating our allies, withdrawing from a leadership position on so many issues in the international system, and pulling back from various agreements and organizations, withdrawing from them and so forth, that make climate change their central focus. I think that is the wrong direction to go, and I think it's in the long run it's very dangerous.
Thank you.
So there was a question in the chat. Has there been any successful cooperation between nations?
There has been some partial success. I think that the Paris Accord, which dealt with emissions, CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, was a partial success in the sense that you had every country, or virtually most of the countries in the world, agreeing that A, this was a problem, and 2, there should be limits placed on it. That in and of itself as a global action was important. The problem with the Paris Agreement was that the targets were established by each country, their own targets, and it was on a voluntary basis. There was nothing mandatory about it. It was not enshrined in international law that emissions had to be cut by X percentage by a certain point in time. So it was a partial success, but I think that there have been, something on the order of 7 or 8 major global environmental conferences now, a number of agreements, the most famous being the Paris Agreement, which we just pulled out of, or I don't think we've formally done it, but we're planning on it very shortly. I think that there is a mood to move in that direction. Most of Europe is far ahead of us right now. Any of you who have traveled throughout Europe and France, Germany, any number of countries, along the rivers in particular, in flat areas, see just a multiplicity of windmills. I mean, they are all over the place now. And many of them have legislated within their governments the reduction of carbon emissions. So I think that there is a move in the right direction, but I think it would be incorrect to say that they're anywhere near adequate. There is some desire and recognition of the problem and a desire to deal with it, but a lack of will, to put it bluntly, and some very powerful economic interest too, by the way.
Okay, any further questions or comments? No? Okay, well, Doug, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. And just a heads up for anyone who's interested we only have 2 summer seminars this summer. And so the next one is in 2 weeks on Monday, July 27th at 1:30. And that's about anti-inflammatory diets. And to register, you can send an email to the same email that you use to register for this, which is reference@madison.mainlib.org. Again, thank you very much, Doug.
Thank you.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe.
Thank you.